right, everyone, get ready because we're going deep today into the world of neuroscience and spirituality. You sent us some pieces from The Spiritual Brain. It's an audiobook by Mario Bogard and Denise O'Leary. And wow, it seems like you're really grappling with some huge questions about the mind and the brain and maybe even, the soul. So are you ready to explore this amazing world where, well, science and spirituality kind of collide?
Absolutely. This book, it really changes the way you think about things. You know what I find really interesting is how the authors, they're neuroscientists themselves, but they challenge that dominant viewpoint, that materialist viewpoint. I mean, they're not just, philosophers or something. They're looking at the actual science and finding some really interesting evidence.
Yeah, materialism, right. The idea that everything, even our thoughts and feelings, it all comes down to like physical stuff happening in our brains. That's kind of the standard view in science.
It is, yeah. But the authors of The Spiritual Brain, they really push back against that. They use all sorts of examples to show how a purely materialist view just doesn't quite cut it.
Okay, give us an example. What kind of evidence are we talking about here?
Well, one example they talk about is that Air France crash landing, in Toronto back in 2005. It was terrifying. A plane full of passengers, a fiery wreck, and amazingly, everyone survived. And you know why?
Why?
Because of just incredible acts of altruism from total strangers.
Yeah, hundreds of people, right, working together, risking their own lives to help others they'd never even met. It's a powerful image. But how does that challenge materialism? I don't quite see the connection.
Well, think about it. If it were all about survival of the fittest, like traditional evolutionary psychology says, wouldn't you expect more of a, every man for himself kind of thing in a crisis like that? But instead, we see this profound selflessness, genuine compassion for others.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It does make you wonder if those basic instincts can really explain the full range of what humans do. But couldn't someone say, hey, even if it looks selfless, altruism is still about survival, right? It helps the group as a whole survive, even if some individuals don't.
That's a great question, and one that, well, evolutionary biologists have been debating for years. But, the authors of The Spiritual Brain, they suggest that maybe, even if there are evolutionary advantages, that doesn't rule out genuine selflessness. They argue that, just focusing on the survival benefits might miss a deeper truth about human nature.
So it's not just about debunking evolutionary psychology. It's about being open to other possibilities, other explanations for these really complex human experiences.
Right, exactly. And they go on to explore other areas where that purely materialist perspective seems to fall short. They even question those primate studies, where researchers try to teach chimps sign language, looking for that spark of human consciousness.
Oh, yeah. I've always been fascinated by those. What's their take on that?
Well, they suggest that maybe instead of showing us the origins of human consciousness, those studies are actually showing us the limits of the chimpanzee mind. In other words, maybe they're showing us what chimps can't do, rather than, illuminating the depths of human potential.
So shifting the focus from how are we like apes to what makes us uniquely human.
Exactly. And to connect this to the even bigger picture, they suggest that if a purely materialist view has trouble explaining human behavior, maybe it's also not enough to explain the universe itself. They bring up the work of this astronomer, Guillermo Gonzalez, and all the controversy around his book, The Privileged Planet.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this controversial research.
Well, Gonzalez's research, it was all about, where life could exist in the galaxy.
Yeah.
And he found that Earth is positioned in this really, really unique way, almost as if it was designed for, astronomical observation. This really challenged the prevailing worldview in science. And he got a lot of criticism for it, because it kind of opened the door to intelligent design ideas.
So the idea that maybe our place in the cosmos is, well, a bit more special than just pure chance would allow.
Exactly. The authors of The Spiritual Brain use this to explore the concept of anthropic coincidences.
Anthropic coincidences? That sounds complicated.
It's not really. It basically refers to the fine-tuning of our universe. Take the strength of gravity. It seems almost too perfect to be random. If it were just a tiny bit stronger or weaker, stars and planets, like Earth, couldn't even exist.
It's like the universe is set up just right for us to be here. Mind-boggling. But, okay, let's bring it back down to Earth, or more specifically, to the human brain. If materialism isn't quite working to explain the universe or even human behavior, what does neuroscience actually tell us about the mind and its relationship to the brain?
That's where things get really interesting. The book goes into this revolutionary concept, neuroplasticity, the idea that the adult brain isn't fixed, that it can actually change based on our experiences and choices.
Okay, I'm getting like brain upgrade vibes here. Wait, you're saying our thoughts and actions can literally change the structure of our brains?
Yes. Think of it like rewiring the circuitry. They talk about studies on treating OCD, where they use mental training techniques to like reprogram the brain's response to obsessive thoughts.
So you're saying our minds can actually change our brains. That's a pretty strong argument against, that whole mind is just a product of the brain thing, right?
It is. And here's where the book takes another fascinating turn. It brings in quantum physics and how its principles might be at work within the brain.
Quantum physics. Okay, now we're going to get really deep. But seriously, how does quantum physics fit into all of this?
It might seem like a big jump, but the authors do a great job of explaining it clearly. They argued that the brain might operate on quantum principles, meaning things like uncertainty and probability. They're just part of how it functions.
So instead of our brains being like these predictable machines, there's an element of, well, possibility. Like we're choosing from a range of potential outcomes.
That's the idea. They bring up something called the quantum Zeno effect, which basically says that focused attention can influence the state of a quantum system.
Hold on. I need to process this. So they're saying our focused attention, our intentions can have a real effect on our brains, on our reality.
That's what they're proposing.
Yeah.
And they suggest this might be how free will works. In a quantum system, we're not just watching our brain activity, we're participating, making choices that actually shape our reality. It's a pretty radical concept.
Definitely radical. And it seems like we're finally getting to the heart of the matter, the exploration of mystical spiritual experiences. But how do they even define those? What counts as mystical or spiritual is so, well, subjective, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's tough to pin down those definitions. The book actually uses the analogy of overlapping circles to illustrate how hard it is to separate religious, spiritual, and mystical experiences.
Yeah.
But even with those challenges, the authors highlight some really fascinating research.
Okay, give us some examples. What kind of research?
Well, they talk about the work of Sir Alister Hardy and his Religious Experience Research Unit. It was a group dedicated to studying people's firsthand accounts of spiritual experiences. And guess what they found?
What?
Things like prayer, meditation, even just experiencing the beauty of nature. These could be common triggers for those profound states of consciousness.
So they're saying these experiences aren't limited to, like, a select few. They're accessible to many of us, just in different ways.
Exactly. And then there's the author's own research. With Carmelite nuns, they used brain imaging techniques to study the nuns during mystical experiences, and the results are groundbreaking. They found that those experiences weren't in one specific area, like some might expect. It involved a whole network of brain regions.
So it's not just some isolated brain glitch. It's a complex whole brain phenomenon.
Exactly. And the authors suggest that this complexity supports the idea that these experiences are more than just random brain activity. They're complex, organized events. That can have a huge impact on the person. But we'll dive deeper into that in the next part of our deep dive.
This is all so fascinating. I can't wait to hear more. Okay, so we're picking up where we left off, talking about the research on mystical experiences and how they actually show up in the brain. But I'm wondering, if these experiences are more than just like brain states, what does that mean? What if they're glimpses into like another reality? I mean, that's some pretty big stuff to consider, right?
It is, and you're right. The authors of The Spiritual Brain, they don't shy away from those big questions. They even get into this whole debate about whether, God created the brain or the brain creates God.
Whoa, now those are some really deep philosophical waters. I can see how this research could make people, well, uncomfortable. It challenges a lot of assumptions.
It does. And the book acknowledges that spiritual experiences, they're definitely influenced by culture. Think about it. A Christian mystic's experience, it's probably going to be very different from a Buddhist monk's experience.
Right. Our religious and cultural background, it shapes how we understand and experience the spiritual.
But here's the thing. The authors also point out that even with those differences, there are some core elements of the mystical experience that seem to transcend cultural boundaries. Things like a sense of unity, profound insight or knowledge, and a deep transformative change in the individual.
So while the specifics might differ, there's this common thread running through these experiences. Regardless of someone's religion, does that suggest there's something more universal going on here?
That's what the authors are getting at.
Yeah.
They propose that those common elements might be evidence that these experiences are, connecting with something real, something outside of ourselves.
It's interesting. Even though I consider myself a pretty rational person, I've had those moments while meditating or in nature where I felt this sense of like connection of peace. It's hard to explain. I can see how someone might interpret that as connecting to something larger than themselves.
That's a great point. And it highlights how these experiences, they can be very personal, but also point toward something universal. Now, it's important to remember, the authors aren't saying neuroscience can definitively prove or disprove the existence of God. That's not what they're trying to do.
Right. So what are they saying? What's the main takeaway?
Well, they're focusing on showing that science can offer valuable insights into the nature of spiritual experience, and that those insights challenge that purely materialist view. They're arguing for a more, well, nuanced and open-minded approach to understanding the spiritual side of humans.
That makes sense. But let's be
Well,
real, not all spiritual experiences are, sunshine and rainbows. Sometimes things can go wrong. I mean, look at history. There are plenty of examples of how spiritual beliefs can be twisted, manipulated.
that's a really important point, and the book doesn't ignore that darker side. They mention figures like Jim Jones, the cult leader who led his followers to mass suicide, as examples of how, well, spiritual beliefs can be distorted and used for harmful purposes.
It's a good reminder that, yeah, spiritual experiences, while often positive, can also be dangerous if you don't approach them with critical thinking, discernment. It makes you wonder, how do we tell the difference between healthy spirituality and, well, something more harmful?
That's the crucial question, and honestly, one the authors don't claim to have a definitive answer for, but they emphasize that they aren't endorsing any particular religion or belief system. They're simply advocating for a, well, more nuanced understanding of human spirituality.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit
Okay.
and talk about some of the practical implications. The book has a whole chapter on the impact of spiritual experiences on individuals.
Right. And they highlight how those experiences can lead to positive changes, like increased empathy, compassion, even improvements in mental and physical health.
It makes sense, intuitively. If you feel more connected to something bigger than yourself, you might be more likely to treat others with kindness, compassion. But is there actual scientific evidence to back that up?
There is, actually. They cite studies that show a correlation between spirituality and well-being.
Hmm.
People who report having spiritual experiences, they tend to be happier, healthier, more resilient in the face of challenges.
So it's like spirituality gives you a buffer
So
against stress. But how do these experiences actually change people? Is it just a change in mindset, or is there something more going on, something deeper?
that's where that concept of neuroplasticity comes back in.
Yeah.
Remember, we talked about how the brain can change based on our experiences. Well, spiritual experiences, they're no different. Those profound encounters, they can actually reshape the neural circuitry, leading to lasting changes in how we think, feel, and behave.
So it's not just about believing something different. It's about literally changing the structure of your brain through these experiences. I have to admit, that's pretty mind-blowing.
It is. The book even mentions some interesting examples, like people who've overcome phobias or managed to rewire their brains to better deal with obsessive thoughts through practices like mindfulness and meditation.
It's like these experiences unlock a potential for healing and transformation that we might not even be aware of.
And that potential for transformation is, well, a key theme in the book. It's about recognizing the power of these experiences to change not just our minds, but our brains, and ultimately who we are.
That's a powerful message. But I still have a question about what's actually happening in the brain during these experiences. If there isn't a specific God spot, like some have suggested, then what's going on in there?
Well, the author's research with those Carmelite nuns, it gives us some clues. They found that the mystical experiences involved a network of brain regions, including areas associated with attention, body awareness, visual imagery, even self-consciousness.
So it's not just one part of the brain lighting up. It's like a symphony of brain activity, different areas working together to create this unified experience.
Exactly. And the author suggests that this complexity, it supports the idea that these experiences are more than just, random brain firings. They're complex, organized events with a huge impact on the individual.
This is all so fascinating. But I can't help but wonder, if these experiences can be so transformative. How can we tell if it's genuine? How can we tell the difference between, let's say, a real spiritual experience and, well, a hallucination or a delusion? Is there any way to know for sure?
That's a crucial question and a really tough one. Honestly, it's one that neuroscientists are still trying to figure out. But the book does offer some interesting perspectives. which we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, I'm definitely hooked. Let's get to it.
All right, so we've talked about how powerful these spiritual experiences can be and how they can even like reshape our brains. But the big question for me is, how do we know if they're real? Like, how do we know if they're really connecting us with something outside of ourselves and not just like a trick of the brain?
Yeah, you've hit on the core issue there. The book admits there are no easy answers. It's hard to measure something like a spiritual experience objectively.
It feels like we're moving beyond hard science now into philosophy and like personal interpretation. Can science even handle those kinds of questions? Good point. We are definitely in more philosophical territory now. But that doesn't mean we should just give up, right? The authors say we can still think critically, look for clues within the experiences themselves.
Okay, I like that. Staying curious, but grounded too. So what clues are we talking about? How can you tell if someone's having a genuine mystical experience or just, hallucinating?
One clue they talk about is the lasting impact, the way these experiences can change people. A lot of people who have these profound mystical experiences, they say it changes their personality, their values, their whole perspective on life. It's not just a temporary thing. It's a fundamental shift.
So it's not just a mood boost, it's deep, lasting change.
Right. And the authors point out that this change, it's often about positive qualities, like more compassion, more altruism, a sense of purpose, even a feeling of being connected to everything. You wouldn't usually associate those changes with like hallucinations or delusions.
No, not really. It's like that these experiences are showing us something deeper, something that connects us to something bigger.
That's the idea. And while some people who really stick to that materialist view might say, oh, those changes are just brain chemistry, the authors suggest there's more to it than that.
They're basically arguing for the soul, or at least for some kind of spiritual reality that we can access through these experiences.
Exactly. And they say even if we can't prove that reality exists scientifically, the effects of these experiences, they're hard to ignore. They argue that, well, maybe the most reasonable explanation is that these people really are connecting with something real, something outside of themselves.
It's a powerful argument. It makes us rethink what's possible. But if this materialist view is so limited, why is it so popular in science? Why are so many scientists reluctant to even consider these other explanations?
It's complicated, but I think part of it is fear. Fear of like opening Pandora's box. Because if you admit there might be a spiritual reality, it raises a ton of questions. Questions that science might not be able to answer. It challenges what we think we can know and measure.
It's like going into uncharted territory. That can be scary for scientists who are used to working within, well, a more defined materialist system. And then there's the whole history of conflict between science and religion.
Right. That history definitely plays a role. For centuries, science and religion have often been, well, at odds, each one trying to be the authority. So it makes sense that some scientists are hesitant about anything that sounds even a little bit religious or spiritual.
That classic science versus religion debate. But this book seems to be suggesting a different way, a way to bridge that gap.
That's what's so cool about it. The authors aren't saying go back to blind faith or anything like that. They're suggesting a more balanced approach, one that values both the scientific method and the possibility of real spiritual insight.
It's like they're saying, hey, science and spirituality can get along. They can actually help each other out.
Exactly. It's an invitation to approach these big questions with curiosity, with humility, recognizing that we don't know everything.
It reminds us that there's still so much we don't know about the universe, about consciousness, about the nature of reality.
And that, I think, is what's so exciting about all of this. The more we learn, the more we realize how much more there is to discover.
So where does that leave us? What's the takeaway message for our listeners?
I think the main message is, don't be afraid to ask the big questions. Don't let a materialist worldview limit your understanding of what's possible.
Be open to the mystery. Embrace the unknown.
Exactly. The universe is vast, it's complex, and we're just starting to understand its mysteries. Who knows what we might discover if we're willing to look beyond our current understanding.
That's a great point to end on. It's been an amazing deep dive into the spiritual brain. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did.
And if you're interested in learning more, definitely check out The Spiritual Brain by Mario Bogard and Denise O'Leary. It's a really thought-provoking exploration of where science and spirituality intersect.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.